Hi, everybody. This is Natalie Clont Spellman, and I'm coming to you today remotely because I'm all shut in, probably just like you are. And I'm going to be speaking to you about history. And as we sit here today, we're actually living history. So enjoy the fact that we're actually living something that we'll be talking about for the rest of our lives and that will be written about probably for the rest of time. There's an old proverb, or maybe it's a curse that says, may you live in interesting times. I believe we do. They're not always easy, but we'll come out of it and we'll be the better for it. So hang in there. And to everybody who's an essential worker and who's doing what they have to keep us all safe and to keep the economy running, thank you very much. And we all really appreciate it. And everybody, please be safe. And we want to see you again. And hopefully we'll all return to normal soon and we'll all be there to speak to one another and get back together like we usually have. So down to the business at hand. Also, I want to thank the city of Jenison for giving me this opportunity to speak to you about wild women of the West today, or this evening, or whenever you're watching. I want to thank you, and I'm humbled at the privilege. And we're going to speak to you about some interesting women. As always, sometimes we just talk about the men of different areas, but the women also are of interest, and sometimes they're the most surprising. And it's no different here in our area. One of the first ones that we're going to talk about this time is Belle Starr. And this is her picture here on the front of the presentation. I hope you can see it on your screen. She's just an ordinary looking person. But before we get into that, I'm going to start with some shameless marketing. But if you want to know more about these stories, I can't get into a lot of depth because I'm limited on time. You can check out my books, the stories I'm going to mention if I have time in this presentation, or in my books, Quantrill's Raiders of North Texas. I have an updated version now. And the Belle Starr story is going to be in Quantrill's Raiders. That's a really interesting book if you want to pick that up. The story I'm going to have about Sophia Coffee is in the saga of Preston Bend and Glen Eden. And then part of her story is also in a book I don't have the picture of here, but it's Crime and Calamity in Preston Bend. And it's the third volume of the When the West Was Wild series that I have out. And that's a really good series. Here's the second volume of When the West Was Wild in Denison, Texas. And here's volume 4, When the West Was Wild in Pottsboro, Texas, Crime and Calamity. And if you like train stories, this one has a ton of train stories in it. And I also have a brand new When the West Was Wild volume 5 out. And it's a real humdinger. If you like outlaws and lawman stories, that's all it's basically about, is the struggle between good and evil, between outlaws and lawmen in the late 1800s. I hope you'll really like it. I enjoyed writing it. And then the story about Olive Ann Oatman, the lady that was a captive of the Indians for a time and lived in Sherman. It's in my book, Texoma Tales. I would love for you to check those out if you have time. If not, just enjoy this presentation. And these books are available on Amazon, from my bookstore on Etsy. It's Pottsboro, Texas Books. They're at the Book Rack and from Main Street Mall. Of course, both of those stores being on Main Street in Denison. You can get them at the Frontier Village Museum in Denison. You can get them at the Touch Class Antique Mall, Sherman on the Square. And I have a tour company. We were going to have Wild West tours in downtown Denison during Doc Holiday Festival, but it was canceled. I'm not sure when we're going to have the Wild West tours. We will have ghost tours this fall, hopefully, if nothing untoward happens. We have a Facebook page, Red River Tours. You can look on there for the latest information. It's very informative tour. It's usually 2 hours, and it goes into a lot of Denison history. It's not just ghost stories, but it's a lot of history. If you're a history lover, come to that. Now let's start with our history presentation with Belle Starr. Now, Belle Starr was not born with the name Belle Starr. She's just an ordinary person, just like you or me, and her name was Myra Maybelle Shirley. Her last name was Shirley. And her parents called her Belle because her middle name was Maybelle. And she was born in a little farm in Carthage, Missouri. And she was just one of 6 children. Her parents were farmers, John and Elizabeth Shirley. And Elizabeth was a Hatfield. I'm not sure if she's part of the Hatfields and McCoys fame. Maybe so. Her parents moved to Carthage, Missouri, and her father was an innkeeper, and he was also a slaveholder. So you already know that when the Civil War rolled around, they were on the southern side. And so when the Civil War came along, the Missouri and Kansas was a border state. That there was really a huge controversy between Kansas and Missouri. It was a power struggle in the United States between which one was going to be a slave state, which one was going to be a free state. It would alter the balance of power in politics. They had politics back then just like they do now. They were trying to keep slavery out of any more states. The slave South wanted more slavery in other states so they could get a firmer hold on politics. And you know how that goes, how it would go if it was that way today. Everybody wants more power. But back then it got ugly and people were going and raiding and burning each other's farms and killing each other on the border states. People from Kansas would come and kill and burn in Missouri and likewise. So it was really rough there. And Frank and Jesse James and Cole Younger family was embroiled in this because they lived in northwestern Missouri, right on the border with Kansas. And so they were caught up in the same problem. So that was how the Shirleys and the Youngers and the Jameses all became familiar because they all lived in a comparable area there in Missouri, and they were all afflicted by the same thing. And 2, you have to remember, this was the beginning of railroad travel, and these people traveled more than we might envision that they did. Some of them traveled on horseback and in wagons, but some of them might have traveled on the trains. And Belle Starr was quite a well-traveled young woman. She traveled most of the western U.S. from Texas to Missouri to California, and that was true of Frank and Jesse James and the Youngers. All of those, they were very well-traveled people. Even, of course, we know they went up to Minnesota, is where they got caught in that robbery. And back to Belle Starr, she attended the Carthage Female Academy, so she was a very well-educated young lady, as many of the people there in Missouri were. She went to Craven's school, a private school, and she had a talent for music. But we also know that she had a talent for riding and shooting. And that came out, as we'll know later. But it makes you wonder, if it hadn't been for the war, who would she have been? At the start of the Civil War, they were Southern sympathizers, as I said before. And, of course, they were on William Quantrill's side. Remember Quantrill's Raiders. And most of the people there in Missouri joined with the Confederate guerrilla William Quantrill whenever uh, many of their uh, family members were killed or wounded in that jail collapse in Kansas. So that just fueled their fire to go and cause more havoc and to join the cause and fight against the Yankees. And after the burning and the destruction came to Carthage, Missouri, and the Civil War battles came there, the Shirley family decided they couldn't stay there any longer, that they were going to be killed. And so in 1864, they moved out of Carthage and moved down to Cheyenne, Texas, which is east of Dallas. It's right around Mesquite now. And they opened a hotel and tavern there. And other Quantrill men and many other Southern Confederate sympathizers and Confederate soldiers made that a haven because it was a safe place for them. And then Belle, she also later married an outlaw named Jim Reed, who was also part of the James Younger gang after the war. And they lived together in the Indian Territory at the home of Tom Starr. And you're beginning to see where Starr comes into it. And he was a Cherokee Indian. And when he was charged with murder, they hid out in Los Angeles. And when they returned, Reed became involved with the James Younger gang, which, you know, they were doing a lot of their mischief that time around Arkansas and Texas and into Missouri especially. And they were attracting a lot of attention from law enforcement, of course. And Jim Reed got himself killed by a deputy sheriff in Paris, Texas. So Belle was already acquainted with the Starr family. And after Jim's death, she married Sam Starr, who was also half Cherokee. And after a little while, Belle and Sam, they were charged with horse theft. And probably they were guilty. And she received 2 6-month terms. And these were federal terms, and they had to be served out in Detroit, Michigan. And so they sent her all the way up to Detroit, Michigan to serve out her prison terms. And at this time, this is when the newspapers started calling her the bandit queen. And people really started catching up to the name Belle Starr. And after this marriage happened and was over with, Belle took several lovers, and one of them was the infamous Blue Duck. You might, if you've ever watched the miniseries Lonesome Dove, you've probably heard of Blue Duck. Well, there was a Blue Duck, and he was a part Indian, and Belle Starr was involved with him too, which probably shouldn't be any strange thing to you. Belle Starr was quite a character herself. And here's a picture of Belle Starr and Sam Starr in the Indian Territory together. At least I think this was taken in the Indian Territory. And she cuts quite a handsome figure on her horse here. And Sam Starr is quite a rough-looking customer. And we're going to see that here in just a moment, that he absolutely was, and so was she. Now we're going to see some of the encounters that were had with her here in the Texoma area. Belle Starr did come here, and we have documentation of that. Now this old house is right out, or it was, I think it I don't know how much is left of it right at this moment, if there's any, because the last time I was by this house, it looked like it had completely fallen down, and this was taken a couple of years ago. And it's right at the intersection of Highway 120 and the old Preston Road, not 289, but the old Preston Road, before you get to 1417 coming from Denison. And the old Preston Road is just right on the right side of this house. And then 120 is right in front of it. So that's where this house sat. So it was in a very strategic place, and it's a lot of history in its time. And it was known as the old Looney House. Now, some of y'all may get a laugh out of that. It wasn't called the Looney House because it was a crazy place. It's because that's where the Looney family lived, and no, they weren't crazy people. That was their name. And they were well-known, well-respected people in the Pottsboro area. And Mr. Looney had a store, Looney's grocery store, for many years in Pottsboro, and our mail carrier was named Mr. Looney, Choice Looney, and they were great people. And Early Looney was the man who lived in this house right here, and they lived here for way on back, as far back as anyone can tell. So they were very early pioneers of this area. And we're here before the cattle drives. And it's the Looney people recall that on their way to Kansas City, herds that would come through here would take all day to travel through the valley across from the house. And a person could walk on the backs of the cattle from the hill where the house is to the other hill on the west side near 1417. There were so many cattle, and it was this thick all day long. Can you imagine how many cattle that is? And they weren't just standing, they were driving them across. And it said that Early Looney went on Mr. Chisholm's last cattle drive when he was young. And this old house also saw Belle Starr camp with her gang right across the road from it. So this old house, indeed, if the walls could talk, it could say a lot of things. Thankfully, we have a few of the stories that have still survived. And another old pioneer that's well known in Pottsboro and really well known throughout all of Grayson County was Rufus I. Holder. The Holder family was a very early pioneer. In fact, one of their houses that is at the Frontier Village. It was one of the oldest, it is the oldest still standing school in Texas, the Cold Springs School. That was their house out on Preston Road. And this was the Holder house. And he remembered seeing Belle Starr, and he recorded this in a 1954 newspaper article. And here's what he said. It's a very interesting story. He said he was a boy, and he was en route to Ardmore, Oklahoma, from his home just east of Georgetown near the Loonies, with his uncle, Ev Holder. Now, these were tough people. The Holders had been in the Civil War, and there are other stories about them that when there was trouble, they went and handled it themselves, if you know what I mean. And they weren't afraid. They would form posses and go and take care of outlaws themselves. They didn't depend on lawmen because there weren't any at the time. They were the lawmen. If you went, you had to take care of yourself back in those days, and they were very able to do it. So if these men got rattled, it was something to sit up and take notice of. So Rufus was riding a mule, and his uncle was riding a fine horse on his way to Ardmore. He said, "We're riding across the creek when a couple on Indian Bottom, looking for a place to get paint horses, stopped us. Although I didn't know who they were, my uncle recognized them as Belle and Sam Starr, the picture we saw earlier of her sitting on the horse. And you saw how tough he looked. Sam had a Winchester rifle across his saddle. Belle had a couple of guns strapped on her. Belle rode up to my uncle and asked him if he wanted to swap horses. He told her he didn't, but I noticed he was kind of uneasy. I knew something was up because my uncle was no coward. He said Belle, who was on a small pony, would ride around his uncle's horse, and when she got to its head, kick it with her spurs. This would make his uncle's horse rear up. She did that about 3 times, repeating as she rode by, "Don't you want to swap? You sure?" Holder said while she did this, Sam Starr sat motionless on his horse, ready for action. Finally, Belle seemed to tire of this and told them to go on while you still can. We rode off. My uncle didn't look back or say a thing until we were out of gun range. Then he told me who they were, said Holder. The Belle Starr I remember was slim, rather tall, and looked like she must have weighed about 120 pounds, recalled Holder. She was tan from the sun, looking like she might have had a little Indian in her. She had a buckskin suit, the kind you could hang on a nail with her in it and it wouldn't tear. Holder said while her voice was feminine and not unpleasant, it still was packed with authority. He also said dryly, even though I didn't know who she was at the time, if she had asked me for my mule, she would have gotten it. It's not believed she herself was Indian, but she married an Indian named Sam Starr. She lived with Indians in the nations and built a school for them. If she could have heard him give the statement that she looked Indian, she no doubt would have considered that a high compliment. And here we come to Belle Starr and Cole Younger. There was a story with them, especially. I think he must have been her love, as far as I'm concerned. I'm not sure. We'll never know. But during the Civil War, Cole Younger was said to have had a child with her named Pearl Younger, because that's what Belle named her, Pearl Younger. And she lived up in around where Porham, Oklahoma is now, and she named it Younger's Bend. And seems like it was in honor of Cole Younger. And Cole Younger was quite an intelligent man himself, very intelligent man, and as were all of his family. They were very high-class people before the war. In fact, they were Northern sympathizers before the war. The fact that the Kansas people attacked them is the only reason they went toward the South during the war. But anyway, this isn't about Cole Younger. While living in the Indian Nation, more about that in my book, Raiders, Quantrill's Raiders. While living in the Indian Nation, later on, she didn't live a long life, unfortunately. An assassin shot her from an ambush, which is probably the only way it could have gotten her. Nobody knew exactly who did it. Nobody was ever charged. And while she was still alive, she was taken to her cabin, and she died just a little bit later, and she was almost 41 years old. So she never got to live a long life. And the women in the area really loved her because of all the things she had done for the people there. They dressed her in her finest black velvet riding habit, her boots, and decked her out with their expensive jewelry and put her pearl-handled Colt 45 in her hands and put her in a casket. And during the funeral, the Indians would come along and each drop a crumb of cornbread in the coffin, as was their custom. And they sealed her tomb, but unfortunately, people came along later and robbed her grave and stole her pistol and her jewelry and so forth. It's terrible. But her daughter Pearl later came along and erected her a nice headstone with an engraved. I have a picture. I hope you can see it here. With an engraved bell, a star, a horse, and a poem which read, "Shed not for her a bitter tear, nor give the heart to vain regret. 'Tis but the casket that lies here, the gem that filled it sparkles yet." And we're still talking about Belle Starr. So in a way, it's true. She still lives on. She still rides on. The bend in the Colorado River where she lived was named Younger's Bend. It's still known for that. Her cabin burned, but her grave is still there. The Younger Bend School went on for a long time, but maybe her final legacy, maybe that was the one that was the one she wished for the most. Her daughter remembered her very well. She was greatly loved by all the people that she helped, and she was known as a philanthropist and a loving mother and a woman of spirit. And that's not a bad legacy for all her faults. And the next lady we'll be looking at is Sophia Coffee Butts Porter, and that's not all her last names, believe me. We'll look into that briefly, but I have two very long books about Preston Bend. We won't be able to cover everything about this dear lady and the town in which she lived. It's very interesting. And she was known as the Confederate Lady Paul Revere. Sorry, I'm at home, and that's what happens. Okay, get that turned off. So Preston Bend goes back. It was up on the Preston Bend of the river north of where Denison would later be. It started out as a trading post. And a man named Colonel Holland Coffee traveled down and started this trading post with the Indians. And there's a lot about that in my book. I can't go into all that. It's very interesting. But it's it was the only town. Sorry. It was the only town besides Austin, really. There was Austin, and then maybe a little bit in Dallas. Dallas wasn't much of a city. And there was Preston, even before Sherman started. So Preston was a very important trading post in this part of the country. So Sophia was born in 1815, and her name was Suttonfield. In 1833, she married a man named Jesse Augenbaugh, and they came to Nacogdoches in Texas. And that didn't last too long. They were part of the runaway scrape in 1836 during the fight for independence. And she claimed that he deserted her, which wasn't very chivalrous of him. And Sophia claimed that in April of 1836, she was she ended up at the Battle of San Jacinto with Sam Houston, and that she helped dress his battle wounds there, and that they had struck up a friendship, which we have her word for that. We don't know. I have no reason to doubt her. And they became very good friends for the rest of their lives. And Holland Coffee, coincidentally, at about that time, was a member of the House of Representatives in the new Republic of Texas, and he met Miss Sophia. Phones. And Miss Sophia was a very pretty woman, and Holland Coffee took a shine to Miss Sophia, and he desired to marry her, but she was not free to marry. And so she said, "You're representative. Can't you lobby the Congress to get me a bill of divorce so that we can marry legally?" And so after a lot of trouble, he was able to secure a grant or a bill granting Sophia Augenbaugh a divorce from her missing husband. And so then in January of 1837, she and Coffee were married at Independence in Washington County, Texas, with General Houston in attendance. That's a pretty good witness for your wedding. And then they spent a long honeymoon trip coming up all those like 600 miles to come back up to Preston, where she ended up not in a mansion, but in a little small log house. Shanty is probably what you'd want to call it, a little trading post. But she said she was happy. She was the happiest woman in the world. I don't know. Probably she wasn't satisfied with it, because later she ended up with this house in 1845. Holland ended up employing some Mormons that were passing by to build this beautiful two-story house for Sophia and himself called Glen Eden. And it became the focal point of the whole county for 100 years. It stood there for, well, 99 years, we'll say. And by the way, here's Miss Sophia. That's when she had married one of her other husbands. So she was a very pretty woman. Now, what made her the Confederate Paul Revere is the failed invasion of Texas by the Union in the Civil War. And Quantrill's Raiders were involved in that. They didn't belong to a regular Confederate Army unit. They were more guerrillas, just meant to go and like hit and run. A lot of times they would be out of uniform or wearing Union uniforms. But they were there to assist the regular Confederate Army. And on December 22nd, 1863, General Henry McCulloch was the commander of the troops here in Texas, and he was quartered in Bonham, and he got word that Union soldiers were about to invade Texas. And that's an interesting story, which you can see in my book, Quantrill's Raiders, because it was kind of partly the result of a grudge between General Blunt and Colonel Quantrill. It's almost a little bit funny, the grudge that they had against each other. But anyway, you'll have to see the book for that. In a telegram to Edward Kirby Smith, chief of the Southern armies in the Trans-Mississippi, he noted, "News of reliable character reached me this morning that Jayhawkers," that's the irregular Kansas guerrillas that were sort of like Quantrill's raiders on the other side, in considerable force had penetrated all the way to Gainesville. Indians and Federals, 400 strong. I sent all the cavalry force I had this morning at 8 o'clock, numbering only some 200 men from this place, directing Quantrill from Sherman to meet them at once. And that was thanks to a warning on December 22nd from Sophia Butts, who had remarried after Holland's death, from Glen Eden. And then Quantrill led his men across the Red River into the Indian Territory, where they prepared an ambush for them. And it turned out to be General Blunt's command to invade Quantrill's men for his attack at Baxter Springs as revenge. And just before Christmas, they had, well, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but when Blunt's soldiers were trying to avoid Commander McCulloch's column from Bonham just before Christmas, they ran into Quantrill's raiders and were defeated in a battle from Georgetown to Gordonville. And most people don't realize this battle even took place. And there's also a burial ground out here just by my house. It's in my book about Martin Springs. It's Ghost Towns of Texoma, Volume 3, Martin Springs. It's the Brogdon Cemetery. A lot of them were buried there, as a matter of fact. And even it continues all the way out to Walnut Bend around Gordonville. And they defeated the Yankees, and they had just passed through Preston on their way to Fort Washita, and they were followed by a troop of Northern scouts who stopped for the night. And they thought, well, it would be nice. We've heard tell about Glen Eden and what a nice place that is to stay, and about their wine cellar and how she has all these nice things there. That'd be a nice place to stay for the night because it sure is cold. So they stopped off there at Sophia's house. And so it was the wrong move, really, in the end, because Sophia was 100% Southern. She knew Quantrill and the Confederates were in danger of being ambushed. So one story has it that she locked them in the cellar, down with the wine, and got them all busy eating and drinking and drowsy from doing that. And then she sneaked off and told the Confederates about what happened. She sent messengers off to warn Quantrill and his men, and to warn McCulloch over at Bonham, and then she herself tried to deliver a message to Fort Washita in the Indian Territory to Borland. So she got on a horse because their ferry service was closed at night, and crossed the Red River. Can you imagine December 22nd on a cold night trying to cross the Red River on a horse or a mule at night in the cold? But she did that, and she went several miles into the Indian Territory to let them know the Yankees were coming. And she reached a house that she knew was loyal to the South, and she got an old blanket and rode on, and finally rode as much as 25 miles, not sure, and to let them know what had happened. And that's how she got to be known as the Confederate Lady Paul Revere. And right here is a picture of picture of the wine cellar that was taken next to her house right before they dismantled it, before they were going to tear it down, because they were building Lake Texoma, and it was going to cover her house with water. And this is a picture of her stable, just a drawing, but this is exactly what it looked like. Now, it's quite an interesting story about Sophia's husbands. She, like I told you, she was married many times. She was married to Augenbaugh in 1833, when he deserted her during the runaway scrape in 1836 and took an act of Congress to get her divorced so she could marry again, but she got it done. And her second husband, Holland Coffee, married her in 1837 and brought her up to Preston and built her a beautiful house called Glen Eden up here for her to stay in. But the very next year, he was killed in an Indian duel to the death by a man named Charles Galloway. Now, this is a very interesting story, as many of her husbands are. And poor Sophia gets a bad rap. A lot of things that happened to her aren't really her fault, but some of them might have been, I don't know. She lived in rough times. A lot of people try to badmouth Sophia. Didn't live back then, so we can't really say much about it. So some say that in 1940 or 1846, Sam Houston was scheduled to come. We know that for sure, that he was scheduled to come and dedicate the new county courthouse in Sherman, because the county had just been made a county. Grayson County was new. And Sophia was going to be there for his speech because she was one of his good friends. And Holland Coffee's niece had married Charles Ashton Galloway, which was also a trader, but he was from Fort Washita. And it was said that he defended Sophia by commenting about her relationship with Sam Houston, claiming that it was more than just friends. And it was said that Sophia demanded that Coffee horsewhip his new nephew-in-law because of what he said. And Coffee refused to do it. And Sophia was alleged to have said she would rather be a widow of a brave man than the wife of a coward. Well, you know, there aren't too many men that can stand up to language like that, especially coming from their wife. So he was kind of hemmed into a corner if that be the case. And so Coffee started an Indian duel. And if anybody knows about Indian duels, it's a fight to the death with Galloway. And Galloway was a younger man, and he killed Coffee with a bowie knife. So anyway, she got her honor defended, but it didn't end very well for Coffee. So she was once again a free woman, and it was up to her to go sell her crops and run the plantation, which she had an extensive one by now. And she had gone away to sell her cotton crop. And on one of these visits, she met George Butts, which is a picture of him right here. And he returned with her to manage her plantation. And they probably married before early 1848, not sure exactly when. And they grew the plantation and brought fine furnishings from New Orleans and fine china. And she seemed to be very happy, but it didn't last long. It lasted a good long time, longer than any of her other marriages, but once the Civil War started, Mr. George Butts got murdered. And he had many enemies because he had been instrumental in forcing men to join the army. He was a conscriptor. And some people also think he was killed because he carried large sums of money at times from cotton sales that he made in town. And another story is that, and it could be more true than the others, that there'd been some unpleasantness between him and Sophia and one of Quantrill's men who spent their winter quarters here. At any rate, excuse me, my throat is sore. At any rate, one evening, Butts failed to return home from Sherman, where he'd gone to sell cotton. And Sophia and Quantrill's men, who was camping there at the plantation, and there at the house, some of the officers, went out to search for him, and he wasn't found till 2 weeks after his disappearance and death. And his horse was found tied to a bush, almost starved to death. And one of the men who had gone with Sophia to hunt for Butts was seen wearing Butts's watch. And so people started thinking it was him who had killed Butts. And I believe it was Fletch Taylor was the man concerned. And this ended up being one of the factors that broke up Contras Raiders as a group, the Fletch Taylor incident. But husband number 4. Well, Sophia didn't go very long without a husband. She's a good-looking woman still. And she once again left the plantation to go to Waco, taking some of her faithful slaves with her. Stayed there for a while, and she was quoted in the paper. It was quoted in the paper about her saying that she was 50 years old, but she was a remarkably well-preserved woman, and her charms compelled the admiration of all. So she was, even at 50, she was still a really good-looking woman. And so when she was down there in Waco, there happened to be this man named Judge James Porter from Missouri who had skedaddled out of Missouri. He had seen the writing on the wall and thought, this war is over. It's not going to go the way of the Confederates, and I'm going to go to Mexico, and maybe the Confederates will start over down here. And there was talk of that. And his wife had died during the war too. He himself had been a speaker in the House of Representatives in Missouri. And when he got down to Waco, though, his plans kind of changed because he saw Sophia. And he kind of took a shine to her. And all his plans for Mexico seemed to dissolve away. And the conclusion of it is that him and Sophia got hitched. And instead of going to Mexico, he came back up to live with her at Glen Eden. And he was a very serious-minded, scholarly individual, very great guy as far as what everybody thought. There's a very interesting story about Judge Porter, though, in my book, Crime and Calamity in Preston Den, about what happened one time when somebody had the audacity to steal a cotton wagon from Glen Eden and take it to Denison to try to sell it. He furiously rode up to Denison and took possession of the malefactors, and I don't think they lived too long after they got outside the city limits, as far as what the newspaper article said. He executed summary judgment on him, but he was a judge after all. So there was that. They had a lot of parties at Glen Eden during this time. Previous, it said that they had danced all night. The lights were on all night, and there was just party and party. Everybody went to party at Glen Eden. And but all that changed when Judge Porter moved in, and suddenly Sophia changed as well. She's suddenly uh, not the party girl anymore. She's suddenly a great founder and pious benefactor for the local Methodist church. And she made the statement, things are going to be different at this place from now on. She said, I want you to come see me. Says, I want to be hospitable and have people over, but there'll be no more dancing. For the rest of her life, she busied herself with charity and good works, and that was true. She was always busy. You'd see her horse coming, and she'd be bringing food and supplies to poor people, and she'd be giving money to the church. She built the church up out there. And maybe because of this, her great tragedies seemed to end. Her life got a lot better after that. And she was greatly loved by the community and regarded by everybody in the county, just thought of as one of the leading people in Grayson County, really. And she and this husband died of old age and not violence. So maybe there is something to be said about living a good, clean life instead of the craziness that was going on with her life before. The wild woman of the West had given herself over to a new life, and it worked for her. It really did. You can see it, and I'm really happy for Miss Sophia. So we can all change our spots. And our next lady that we want to talk about is Olive Ann Oatman, and she's a lot of people are interested in this lady. And you may have seen her characters depicted on TV shows that try to imitate this lady because of these tattoos. But she started out as a Mormon immigrant, very pious family, immigrating out to the West, and her family was killed and taken captive, and she was kept as a slave, and then she became a lecturer all over the country, and then she came back here to Sherman to become a simple rancher's wife. So she had quite a life herself, all the way, and she was well-traveled as well, all the way from out to the east, to California, to Texas. She'd really seen too much, poor woman, so she did pretty well. She was born in Illinois in 1837, 6 other brothers and sisters. They were Mormons, and they belonged to a sect called the Brewsterites. And they took a different trail than some of the other wagon trains, and they came into the New Mexico territory, and they were approached by some Yavapai Indians who pretended to be looking for food and tobacco. And they attacked the Oatmans in 1851 and killed every one of them except her older brother Lorenzo, age 15, who was clubbed and left for dead, although he did survive. And captured Olive, age 13 or 14, and her younger sister Mary Ann, age 7. Lorenzo eventually reached a settlement where he was treated, and after returning to the site of the attack with a group of citizens, they buried the rest of the family. And the Oatman girls were used as slaves for about a year till they were traded to a group of more prosperous Mojave Indians. And the new captors were much more civil to the Oatman girls and adopted them into the tribe and gave them plots of land to farm, and that's where they got their tattoos, is in the Mojave tribe in accordance with their customs, because the tattoos meant they would be recognized as Mojaves by their ancestors and be welcomed into the afterlife. And in 1855, the Mojave tribe experienced a drought. Many of them died, including Mary Ann Oatman. But of course, Olive survived. Lorenzo heard stories of an American woman living among Indians, and he tried to find her. He thought it could be his sister. And he tried many times to secure her rescue. And she didn't even know if any of her family was still alive. But finally, Olive agreed to leave the Mojave tribe and go with her brother to Fort Yuma. And prior to entering the fort, someone gave her a dress. And because Olive was just dressed in a Mojave skirt that only covered her below the waist. So she wasn't really dressed decently for white society. And her brother didn't hardly recognize her because she was so sunburnt and she was so much older. And from there, they went to California, and she was traumatized, and she spent days with her hands covering her face probably because people were horrified by her tattoos, and she was probably afflicted by PTSD, maybe by where she was at that time. She had just been through so many traumas in her life, and now here was another one. How many changes could she take? And she was interviewed by California newspapers. A preacher, Royal Byron Stratton, wrote a book about her, Captivity of the Oatman Girls, that was printed in San Francisco in 1857. And then Lorenzo married and moved his family to Whiteside, Illinois, while Olive stayed with Reverend Stratton in New York. So here she is all the way from California to New York, where she gave Indian lectures to promote his book and help with church fundraising drives. And people tried to re-educate her and help her catch up with society and catch up on her schooling. And then right here, I was able to find some pictures. These are pictures of Olive and her brother Lorenzo when they were older, young people, probably in their early 20s. There you can see her with her chin tattoos. She's a very pretty girl. And the handsome woman always wore a dark veil around Sherman to hide her secret, but the secret she hid made her a legend in Arizona, but not Texas. So she came then to Texas and lived for 30 years in Sherman. And these tattoos, by the way, were blue. It's interesting that the Mojaves believed that people that didn't have tattoos would go into a rat's hole when they died. I hope that doesn't happen to me. How about you? And you see this dress with the hash marks, and somebody made this dress for her to mirror the tattoos. I think that's a very beautiful dress, and to complement her chin tattoos and to highlight the beauty of her face. I think it's pretty. In 1865, Olive married a cattleman, Major John Brant Fairchild, and when she did, he burned copies of Stratton's book about her captivity, and he made sure her speaking tours ended. After living in Detroit, Michigan, the Fairchilds moved to Sherman, and Fairchild is the one who founded the City Bank of Sherman, and they lived in a 2-story Victorian house at Travis and Moore Streets. In 1873, they adopted Mary Elizabeth Mamie Fairchild, and she was educated at St. Joseph's Academy, and she was a respected member of Sherman society, but as you can imagine, she was still a little bit troubled. She didn't leave her house very often. She tried to cover her tattoo with face powders, and she wore veils at times. There were times she left Sherman going to Canada for treatment at medical spas, trying to make herself feel better about what she had been through. It's just difficult to imagine the emotional scars that had happened to her, and no telling what kind of nightmares that she must have gone through, and how alone she felt at times, that nobody around here could understand what she had been through. And she was very shy, which you can understand. She did, however, have a sympathy for other people and people that were poor and orphaned, of course. You can understand that. And people, because she herself was an orphan. But she did suffer from depression, as we've said. She was never admitted, though, as some people have said, to an insane asylum. She wasn't insane. She was just understandably a victim of post-traumatic stress, which they didn't know what that was back then, but we understand it now. One ironic twist that I did find amusing is the man who kind of used her for so many years, the Reverend Stratton, was committed to an insane asylum and died there in 1875. Kind of poetic justice, maybe. And his was the book that her husband burned, because her husband always believed that the man had been using Olive all these years just for his own benefit. And Olive lived until 1903, when she died of a heart attack. And she's buried in the West Hill Cemetery in Sherman, where a historical marker has been erected. And let me tell you, if anybody was a survivor and became great, not just in spite of her difficulties, but because of them, it was her. She had been through something that probably none of us will ever experience. If we begin to start to feel down about some of our circumstances, I know some of you are having a really hard time, and maybe some of you worse than others, but some of us are just taking it harder than others. Remember people like that truly went through horrors and survived and came out the other side. Surely we can do the same. We can survive the trials that we're going through and come out to be the better for it. When times get rough, think of Olive Ann, the extraordinary girl who was made extraordinary by overcoming extraordinary suffering. And what little suffering we're going through, we can overcome that. We're tough. We're tougher than that. And I hope to see you all again soon. I enjoy talking to y'all so much. I want to get to see you all again. Please do stay safe so that we can all meet again. And I've enjoyed this very much. I'd like to see you face to face. God bless you. I love you. Want to see you again soon. And goodbye.